Vogtle Unit 3 went into commercial operation on July 31st. Yes. It's just a couple months ago. It's the first new nuclear power plant that America has built in a generation. And it was built with substantial financial support and dedication from the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office. I had the opportunity to visit the plant about a year ago. And the first thing, it's just outside of Augusta, Georgia, and the first thing you see when you arrive at the facility is just how big this thing is, the scale of it, right? The 4 iconic cooling towers rising up, units 1 and 2 already operational, units 3 and 4 just constructed, and you walk into the facility and you see Toshiba turbines the size of sport utility vehicles. And you see steam pipes so large you could quite literally walk around inside one of them. You definitely should not do that, but you could. Miles and miles of piping and electrical wiring that took about 10,000 pipe fitters, electricians, engineers, about a decade to build. And the example of Vogtle is instructive of the tension and the dilemma that faces clean energy infrastructure leaders like many of you in this room in this moment. On the one hand, once fully operational, Vogtle will be the largest source of clean electrons in America, bar none. It's a remarkable feat of human engineering. On the other hand, it took too long, cost too much to build. And that's the opportunity, and that's the challenge in this moment. There are extraordinary outcomes that can be achieved when the public sector and the private sector work together. And yet it's still just so hard to build. Because we are at an inflection point right now. We have this narrow window of time in which to mitigate the worst effects of climate change by transforming our energy system and economy. That said, we know what we have to do. We have most of the technologies that we need to deploy between now and 2050 in order to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees. According to the IEA, we have over 80% of what we need by 2030. And from the report that just came out, the recently published report last week, which we haven't yet had a chance to update the charts with, 2/3 of the technologies, they estimate we have 2/3 of the technologies that we'll need through 2050 are already proven and ready to go. It's going to cost about $10 trillion in the US incrementally to what we're already spending on infrastructure, and that amounts to about an estimated $300 billion per year every year. And we know that most of this investment is going to come from the private sector, not from government. And even though last year, unprecedented, the most investment we've seen in history in this sector, it's still less than half of this sort of rudimentary benchmark of where we need to get to on an annual basis. And even as financial institutions around the world are publicly pledging trillions of dollars to the energy transition, they are challenged in finding quality projects that are investable, that they can put that money against. And that, in many ways, is where government can step in to support addressing those barriers to capital formation. However, the implications of government getting involved in private markets, it's complex. This is not easy stuff. And I think the example of photovoltaic solar is a good one. On the one hand, you do have this extraordinary success story, right? Last decade, 90% cost reduction, and extraordinarily increase in deployment. We also, and this we don't talk about as much, but in America, we kind of got this on the cheap. We spent less in subsidy than a number of other countries around the world, Spain, Germany, China in particular. We benefited from their subsidy. On the other hand, there's a more complicated picture here. We invented PV solar in America, commercialized it overseas. In 1998, the US had about 45% of the global supply chain for solar. By 2020, that had fallen to less than 5% of the global supply chain. Furthermore, it took about a generation, maybe a little less, from the time the first PV solar system connected to the grid in California to when the technology achieved commercial liftoff, which was just a couple of years after the Loan Programs Office financed the first 5 utility-scale solar farms in the United States. A generation. We don't have a generation. We do have unprecedented resources, an unprecedented toolkit in government to accelerate deployment right now through the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS and Science. But we know that those resources by themselves are insufficient. We have to execute. And we have to execute in a way that captures the complexity and the implications of government engaging in competitive markets and supply chains and labor and workforce and community engagement, all of it. And that's why the dialogue is so important. We have to develop a shared understanding between the private sector and the public sector and the whole broader ecosystem around how we're going to get there. And in many ways, that is the origin story and the purpose of the department's Pathways to Commercial Liftoff effort. And it's led by Vanessa Chan and the Office of Technology Transitions here at DOE. And the intent is to create a series of living documents that reflect our best understanding in the department of the current landscape that the private sector is telling us, the current situation that the private sector faces in terms of enabling liftoff for a set of key technologies and sectors. We've done 2 waves of these reports so far. The next wave we've already kicked off. But just to be clear, these reports, they're neither DOE policy nor DOE strategy. They are a dialogue. And it is on the basis of this dialogue that we make policy and strategy. And we figure out how best to put government's enabling toolkit to work. Now, we have a powerful enabling toolkit in government, never more so than right now. The challenge that we face, that maybe isn't always appreciated by the private sector, the challenge that we face in government is that it's extremely fragmented, right? When Congress gives us resources, it's in silos. When they give us authorities, it's in little boxes. And our offices are, by statute, resourced the same in silos. So the only way that this works, the only way that we maximize the value of these resources that we have is through dialogue and through coordination. It's the only way. LPO is one of the tools in our toolkit. For emerging clean energy technologies, we act as a bridge to bankability, shortening the time frame by which these technologies can access commercial debt and low-cost capital. For more mature technologies, we enable the expansion of domestic supply chains and manufacturing, and we make energy transformation affordable and achievable for American workers, consumers, and communities. As of the end of last month, we have over $140 billion of active applications in our pipeline that are seeking about $250 billion worth of investment, or that represent $250 billion worth of project value in total. And taken together, these projects are an example, or a snapshot rather, of where we need to prove momentum over the next decade. So if you look at the investment last year, about $140 billion into energy transition technologies, about 90% of that went to mature technologies, electric vehicles, batteries, solar, wind. LPO and our pipeline is where we're headed, right? It's weighted about 60-40 towards emerging technologies that are proven but have not yet achieved commercial liftoff. We need all of these technologies to scale if we're going to hit, and to start seeing them scale through 2030 if we're going to hit and achieve our goals. And we know in the Department of Energy that we cannot do it alone. We need the private sector to lead. We need you, we need all of us in this room to work together to figure out how we're going to get there. And that's what these 2 days are about. That's what this dialogue is about. It's about figuring out how we can do hard things and achieve extraordinary outcomes.